Peebles notes that there is an attachment that's created between the creditor, the debtor, and the resources, and this remains in place over time. And essentially, barter is looked at as a refusal to enter into long-term relations with individuals along the lines of being a debtor or a creditor. It's also interesting to note that national prestige is often tied up with successful national debt payments and whether or not a country will default on loans, particularly international loans with the International Monetary Fund. In the United States, there have been several responses to the current crisis within the economy, sometimes called a recession within the economy. And amongst these is the use of irony. And individuals, the billionaires for Bush, billionaires for Obama, billionaires for wealth care, as well as, of course, Colbert and the use of satire as a whole, calls into question this notion of billionaires and the use of parody as a whole. And Haugerud, in the article The Dissent in the Age of Billionaires, talks about the wealth inequality as well as income distribution in the United States, with the top 1%ers earning 23.5% of the total national income and 40% of the nation's wealth. In 1980, the average 1%er made 12.5 times the median income. But in 2006, the average income of our richest 1% was a whopping 36 times that of the median household. And by 2005, the percentage of Americans were living in deep poverty and living below half the official poverty line income was at its highest level since the government began to track those statistics in 1975. So really gross inequalities, and we see with the billionaires movement, if you could call it that, the use of satire and parody, where these supposed billionaires will enter into public spaces and enter into dialogue with political activists or with passersby on the street to call into question or to call into question the gross disparity that exists overall. There's a link on the slides for the Billionaires for Wealth Care, where you can see the billionaires in action at a healthcare march in, I believe it's in New York. Anthropologists have looked at the Occupy movement from a number of different perspectives. They've noted the academics as well as financiers have been in their silos, their respective silos, and not really interacted with the broader public to explain what's going on. Maurer looks at the Occupy movement in New York City and Zuccotti Park, and it's interesting because Zuccotti Park is privately held, and so it's an already enclosed commons area within New York City is privately held. And the anthropologist Maurer in particular calls for the need to historically situate the Occupy movement in relation to a larger sense of anti-globalization protests, anti-economic globalization protests, such as the battle in Seattle, the struggle in Davos, amongst other areas where international summits of either the World Trade Organization or the G8 have met, and the the protest movements against economic globalization. And as Maurer points out, the economy, if it's any one thing, it has to do with household management. And this is a historical definition of the economy. And so this is, in essence, putting one's house in order. And indeed, Maurer, along with Ortiz, calls for more anthropological engagement in the economy, particularly in times of crisis. Ortiz notes that during the 1970s, anthropologists, economic anthropologists in particular, were called upon and came out of their academic silos and interacted more with the general population in terms of leading the way for a general discussion of what was happening with the economy. And Ortiz notes that the time for that is now for economic anthropologists. For those in the Occupy Wall Street movement, it's interesting that the movement itself, which has often been talked about as anti-globalization, anti-greed, anti-1%, is also utilizing, of course, digital technologies, Twitter feeds and whatnot, to organize protests, including things like flash mobs in downtown New York on Wall Street. And Juris looks at the Occupy movement and notes that some of the issues of occupation over long periods of time. Occupy brands itself as this acephalous organization without any leaders, and that it's a movement of the people. But when you get into long-term occupation in camps, as Ethan Sinisbau, a student of mine earlier, some of his work with the Occupy movement in New York has found, there are in fact a number of different hierarchies that are recreated and reinforced within the Occupy movement itself. The piece by Juris discusses the notion of eviction in the Occupy movement in Boston, and then the eviction actually becomes a minor event with only 46 campers that are still at the encampment at 5 a.m. in Boston. The interesting thing about Occupy is that it has attempted to look at a number of different issues and to bring individuals, activists together from a number of different theoretical as well as ideological positions in one social movement as a whole. And this, in part, according to some commentators, is what has led to Occupy's transformation and alleged demise as well, with probably the most recent iteration being the Occupy Sandy movement in New York. So overall, again, the big questions here to consider are the overall extent of the Occupy movement and its attempts to confront global capitalism, neoclassical economics, and neoliberalism as a whole, and some of the income inequalities that have resulted. And so the real question is, how do we define poverty? Because if we think about poverty in the United States, that might look very differently when we're conceptualizing poverty on a global level, where we're talking about individuals earning $1 a day, 1 billion individuals earning $1 a day, or 2 billion earning less than $2 a day. So how exactly is poverty defined, and how is that relative, both in country, as with the Gini coefficient, as well as between countries? And then, in terms of wealth and consumption, how much wealth is too much? How much consumption is too much? And then, of course, there's a difference too between wealth and the actual display of wealth, as Max Weber talks about in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I've gone through some of the economic theorists and economic thought that's really informed contemporary neoliberalism in the United States and indeed globally today, and the resultant income inequality, which also results in unequal debt burdens with predatory loan practices such as payday loans, and some of the resistance to these forces of neoliberalism in both the Billionaires movement as well as the Occupy movement.